There is a clearing in the Missouri Ozarks, deep in what is now Mark Twain National Forest, where nothing grows. Not grass, not weeds, not even moss on the stones that mark the perimeter. The soil is dark, almost black, and it has been that way for over 130 years. Local hunters avoid the area. Their dogs refuse to enter it, whining and pulling backward on their leashes when brought too close. On certain mornings, when the fog settles thick between the hills, people claim they can hear it from miles away. Not screaming exactly, something worse than screaming. A sound like breathing, labored and wet, coming from underground, from the earth itself, as if the ground is trying to exhale something it swallowed long ago but cannot fully digest. This place has a name, though few people speak it aloud anymore. They call it Renshaw Hollow. In the autumn of 1891, 17 people lived there, all members of the same family. By winter they were all dead, every single one. Men, women, children, even the infant who hadn't yet been named. What happened in Renshaw Hollow was called a massacre at the time, but that word doesn't capture the full horror of what occurred, because the dead weren't simply killed. They were arranged, positioned with deliberate care in patterns that suggested ritual, purpose, and something far darker than simple murder. And the killer was never found. Or perhaps the killer was found, but the truth was so disturbing that it had to be buried along with the bodies. Welcome to this channel. Today we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Renshaw family settled in the Ozark Highlands of southern Missouri in 1873. They came from Tennessee, part of the steady stream of families pushing westward after the Civil War, looking for cheap land and new beginnings. The patriarch was Jeremiah Renshaw, age 41 at the time of settlement, a former Confederate soldier who'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand at the Battle of Shiloh. He brought with him his wife Rachel, their 7 children, and Rachel's widowed sister Prudence along with her 3 children. They purchased 240 acres of heavily forested land in what was then Howell County for almost nothing, land that other settlers had looked at and passed over because the terrain was too rough, the soil too rocky, the isolation too complete. The nearest town was Willow Springs, 14 miles to the west over roads that became impassable for half the year. But Jeremiah Renshaw seemed to prefer isolation. Neighbors who met him in those early years described him as taciturn, suspicious of outsiders, and intensely protective of his family to the point of paranoia. The Renshaws built their homestead in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges on 3 sides, accessible only by a single wagon trail that wound through dense forest. They cleared just enough land for crops and pasture, leaving the rest wild. They constructed a main house, a barn, and several smaller cabins to accommodate the extended family. By 1880, after 7 years of hard labor, they'd created a largely self-sufficient compound. They grew their own food, raised their own livestock, made their own clothes. They traded occasionally at the general store in Willow Springs, bringing furs and ginseng to exchange for salt, coffee, and ammunition, but these trips were infrequent. Months would pass without any Renshaw being seen in town. This wasn't unusual for frontier families, but even by Ozark standards, the Renshaws were remarkably isolated. They didn't attend church. They didn't participate in community events. They didn't send their children to the schoolhouse that had been established in Willow Springs by 1878. When asked about this, Jeremiah told the few people who inquired that he educated his children himself, and that they had no need of outside instruction. In the decade following their settlement, the Renshaw family grew. More children were born. The older children married, but interestingly, they married within the extended family or brought in spouses from far away, people with no local connections. By 1890, 17 people lived in Renshaw Hollow. Jeremiah and Rachel, now in their 50s, their adult children and their spouses, and a new generation of grandchildren. From the outside, they appeared to be a thriving clan, industrious and prosperous in their way. But there were rumors. There are always rumors about families that keep too much to themselves, and the Renshaws generated more than their share. People in Willow Springs whispered that the Renshaws practiced strange religious rituals, that they'd been heard chanting in the woods at night, that lights had been seen moving through their valley at odd hours. Some said the family had brought Southern conjure practices with them from Tennessee folk magic that straddled the line between Christianity and something older. Others claimed the Renshaws worshipped the devil, though these claims were based on nothing more substantial than suspicion and discomfort with their secrecy. One man who had more direct knowledge of the Renshaws was a peddler named Thomas Hackett, who made regular circuits through the Ozarks selling notions, patent medicines, and news. Hackett stopped at the Renshaw place several times between 1885 and 1891. In a letter to his brother written in 1889, a letter that still exists in a private collection, Hackett described his experiences with the family. He wrote that the Renshaws were always polite but never welcoming, that they conducted their business quickly, and clearly wanted him to leave as soon as possible. He wrote that he'd never been invited inside any of their buildings, that transactions always occurred outdoors regardless of weather. He mentioned that the children seemed unusually quiet and well-behaved, almost unnaturally so, never playing or making noise even when they thought no one was watching. Most disturbing, Hackett wrote that he'd noticed something odd about the family's cemetery, a small plot near the main house where they'd buried their dead. He counted 9 graves, but when he casually mentioned this to Jeremiah, asking if the family had suffered much sickness, Jeremiah had looked at him with what Hackett described as cold fury and told him to mind his own affairs. Hackett wrote, "There was something in his eyes that suggested I had touched upon a subject not meant for outsiders, and I resolved never to mention it again. But I could not help wondering why a family of 17 would have 9 graves in less than 20 years, and why my question about it provoked such anger." The last time anyone from outside the family saw the Renshaws alive was in late September of 1891. Jeremiah and his oldest son, Michael, came into Willow Springs to trade. The store owner, a man named Amos Fletcher, later testified that both men seemed agitated and in a hurry. They exchanged their goods quickly, purchased an unusual quantity of kerosene and ammunition, and left without the usual pleasantries. Fletcher asked if everything was all right. Jeremiah responded, "We're preparing. It's almost time." Fletcher asked what he meant. Jeremiah didn't answer, just climbed onto his wagon and drove off. That was September 26th. By October 15th, the entire Renshaw family was dead. The discovery of the massacre came about by accident. A hunter named Samuel Bridger was tracking a wounded deer on October 16th and followed the blood trail into the Renshaw Valley. As he approached the homestead, he noticed something wrong. The place was too quiet. No smoke from chimneys, no sounds of animals or people. The livestock were gone or dead, and an unnatural stillness hung over the entire area. Bridger called out. No answer. He cautiously approached the main house and found the door standing open. What he saw inside sent him running back to Willow Springs in a state of near hysteria. Sheriff Clayton Harris organized a party and rode out to Renshaw Hollow the next morning. What they found there became one of the most horrifying crime scenes in Missouri history, though much of what the searchers witnessed would never be officially recorded, the details too disturbing to put into public documents. The 17 members of the Renshaw family had been killed, but the manner of their deaths and the arrangement of their bodies suggested something far beyond ordinary murder. The bodies had been positioned in a circular pattern in the clearing in front of the main house, each person placed at specific intervals, all facing inward toward the center of the circle. They'd been arranged by age. From the oldest at what appeared to be the top of the circle to the youngest at the bottom, Jeremiah and Rachel were at the 12 o'clock position. The infant, unnamed and perhaps only a few months old, was at the 6 o'clock position directly opposite. The bodies showed signs of violent death, but the violence had been methodical, almost surgical. Each person had been killed in exactly the same way, with a single deep cut across the throat, made with tremendous force from left to right. The weapon appeared to have been extremely sharp, the cuts so clean they suggested a razor or a blade honed to perfection. But what disturbed the sheriff and his men most was the blood, or rather, the lack of it. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The bodies should have been surrounded by enormous quantities of blood given the nature of the wounds, but the ground around them was relatively clean. Some blood was present, but not nearly enough to account for 17 people dying from severed throats. Sheriff Harris noted in his initial report that it appeared the blood had been collected, though in what containers and for what purpose he could not determine. The arrangement of the bodies, the precision of the wounds, and the missing blood all pointed to ritual killing, but ritual for what purpose? And who could have done this? The family had lived in isolation. The nearest neighbors were miles away. No strangers had been reported in the area. Had one family member killed all the others and then themselves? But the body positioning made this impossible. Someone had to have arranged the final body, and that person was not among the dead. Sheriff Harris searched the property thoroughly. He found no signs of struggle in any of the buildings. The houses were neat, orderly, as if the family had been going about their normal activities before walking out into the clearing to die. Food was on tables, clothes were folded, tools were put away. It looked as though the family had simply paused their lives, gone outside, and allowed themselves to be killed. In the main house, Harris found something that deepened the mystery. On the large table in what served as the family's gathering room, there was a book. Not a Bible, though it resembled one in size and binding. The cover was unmarked leather, dark with age. Inside were handwritten pages in what appeared to be multiple hands, multiple generations of writing. Harris couldn't read most of it. The text was in English, but the spelling was archaic and the language was dense with references he didn't understand. What he could make out suggested the book was some kind of family record, but not a typical genealogy. It described rituals, ceremonies, obligations that passed from generation to generation. There were drawings, crude but detailed, showing arrangements of objects and people, circular patterns similar to how the bodies had been found. On the last written page, in what Harris believed was Jeremiah Renshaw's hand based on comparison with documents Jeremiah had signed in town, there was a final entry dated October 14, 1891, the day before the bodies were discovered. It read, "The cycle completes. 18 years since the last. 18 years until the next. We pay in blood what was promised in blood. May forgiveness find those who come after." Below this was a list of 17 names, every member of the Renshaw family, each marked with a small cross. Sheriff Harris took the book into evidence. He also found, buried in a trunk in the main house, letters and documents that traced the Renshaw family back several generations. The materials suggested the family had a long history of isolated living, moving from place to place, always to remote areas, always keeping to themselves. There were references in the letters to the obligation, the covenant, and the price. A letter from Jeremiah's father, written in 1852, warned Jeremiah that when his time came, he must fulfill the family duty as generations before had done. That failure to do so would bring worse consequences than compliance. The letter didn't specify what the duty entailed, but it mentioned 18-year cycles and necessary sacrifices. Harris tried to trace the Renshaw family further back but found records scarce. The family seemed to appear and disappear from documented history, leaving gaps of years or decades between mentions in census records or land deeds. Harris sent telegrams to authorities in Tennessee, where the Renshaws had lived before Missouri. The response he received from a sheriff in Overton County was disturbing. In 1873, the same year the Renshaws left for Missouri, there had been an unsolved mass murder in Overton County. 9 people, all members of a family connected to the Renshaws through marriage, had been found dead in their home, arranged in a circular pattern, killed by throat cuts. No perpetrator had ever been identified. The sheriff's report from Overton County noted that the family had been known for keeping to themselves, for practicing strange customs, and for speaking occasionally about obligations and covenants that others didn't understand. Harris began to form a theory. The Renshaw family, and perhaps other related families, were part of some kind of death cult that required periodic mass killings. These killings occurred in 18-year cycles for reasons Harris couldn't determine, though he suspected the timing had religious or superstitious significance. The families would settle in remote areas, live quietly for years, and then, when the cycle completed, they would kill themselves or be killed in ritualistic fashion. But this theory had problems. If the Renshaws had killed themselves, who arranged the last body? If they'd been killed by an outsider, who was this person and where had they gone? Harris expanded his investigation. He interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the Renshaws over the years. Most had little to offer. The family had been secretive, strange, but not overtly threatening. One interview, however, provided a crucial piece of information. Thomas Hackett, the peddler, told Harris about his visits to Renshaw Hollow and about the conversation regarding the family cemetery. Hackett mentioned that during his last visit in August of 1891, he'd seen someone at the Renshaw place he didn't recognize, a man of perhaps 50 years, dressed in dark clothes, who'd been standing at the edge of the clearing watching the family work. Hackett had asked Jeremiah who the man was. Jeremiah had said simply, "The witness." Hackett asked what that meant. Jeremiah told him, "Every covenant requires a witness to ensure the terms are met. He comes when the time approaches." Hackett said the strange man had made him deeply uncomfortable, that there was something wrong about him, something that suggested he wasn't quite normal. When Hackett left that day, the man had still been standing there, motionless, watching. Harris tried to find this mysterious witness. He sent descriptions to surrounding counties, posted notices in newspapers, asked if anyone had seen a man matching the description traveling through the area in September or October. No one had. The witness, if he existed, had vanished. Harris began to suspect the witness might be the killer, perhaps a cult leader who traveled from family to family, conducting these ritual murders. But why would the families allow it? Why would 17 people, including parents protecting their children, walk out into a clearing and allow themselves to be killed without resistance? The evidence at the scene showed no signs of restraint, no indication that anyone had been forced. It appeared they'd gone willingly, even the children, which suggested either mass hysteria, religious fervor so intense it overrode survival instinct, or coercion so complete it left no physical trace. The inquest into the Renshaw deaths was held in late October of 1891. The coroner, Dr. Miles Sutton, examined the bodies as best he could given their state of decomposition. He confirmed that all 17 had died from the throat wounds, that the cuts were identical in angle and depth, suggesting they'd been made by the same hand with the same instrument. Sutton estimated time of death as October 14th or 15th, meaning the bodies had lain in the clearing for 1 or 2 days before discovery. Sutton noted several anomalies. First, the bodies showed virtually no signs of animal predation, which was unusual given that they'd been left in the open in an area with bears, wolves, and other scavengers. Second, the lack of blood remained unexplained. Sutton calculated that 17 people should have produced roughly 20 gallons of blood. But nowhere near that amount was found at the scene. Third, several of the bodies showed marks on their wrists and ankles, faint but visible, suggesting they might have been bound at some point before death, though no bindings were found. The inquest ultimately ruled the deaths as murder by person or persons unknown, though Sutton privately told Harris he believed the family had been involved in their own deaths somehow, that the scene suggested cooperation rather than victimization. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Renshaw family was buried in a mass grave in the Willow Springs Cemetery. No one claimed the bodies. No relatives came forward. The family's isolation had been so complete that if other Renshaws existed elsewhere, they either didn't know about the deaths or chose not to acknowledge them. The property in Renshaw Hollow was seized by the county for unpaid taxes in 1893. Several attempts were made to sell it, but no buyers emerged. People avoided the place. Stories began to circulate about strange occurrences there. Hunters reported seeing lights in the valley at night, hearing sounds like chanting or weeping. Several claimed to have seen figures moving through the clearing where the bodies had been found, 17 shapes arranged in a circle, visible for a moment before fatting. These reports were dismissed as superstition and imagination, but they persisted. By 1900, the Renshaw property was effectively abandoned, left to return to forest. Sheriff Harris continued investigating the case for several years, even after he retired in 1898. He'd become obsessed with understanding what had happened, with finding the witness or whoever had orchestrated the massacre. In 1901, Harris received a letter that renewed his investigation. The letter was postmarked from Kentucky, and it was unsigned, but the writer claimed to have information about the Renshaw family. The writer said the Renshaws were part of a group called the Covenant of Blood, a sect that had existed for centuries, possibly originating in medieval Europe. The sect believed that certain families were bound by ancient pacts to periodically offer sacrifices to appease supernatural forces. These sacrifices occurred in 18-year cycles, tied to astronomical alignments that the sect considered significant. Families in the covenant would live normal lives between sacrifices, but when the time came, they would fulfill their obligation, killing themselves or being killed in prescribed rituals. The writer said the covenant had many families spread across America and perhaps Europe, all practicing the same rituals, all maintaining the same secrecy. The writer warned Harris that investigating the covenant was dangerous, that outsiders who learned too much tended to disappear or suffer fatal accidents, and that Harris should abandon his inquiry if he valued his life. Harris didn't abandon the inquiry, but he also didn't make much progress. The anonymous letter provided no verifiable information, no names or locations that Harris could follow up on. He tried to find other families that might be part of the alleged covenant, looking for similar patterns of isolation and mysterious deaths. He found a few possibilities, families that had disappeared or suffered unexplained tragedies, but nothing conclusive. In 1904, Harris died suddenly of what was ruled a heart attack. He was 62 years old and had been in good health. Some people in Willow Springs whispered that he'd been killed for getting too close to the truth, that the covenant had reached out and silenced him. More likely, he'd simply succumbed to age and the stress of his obsession. After Harris's death, the Renshaw case faded from active investigation. The file was archived, and new sheriffs had new problems to deal with. The case might have remained forgotten except for what happened in 1909, exactly 18 years after the massacre. A family named Carson, recent arrivals to Howell County, disappeared. All 6 members vanished from their isolated farm in circumstances eerily similar to the Renshaw case. When authorities investigated, they found the farm abandoned, the family gone, and in the clearing in front of the house, scorch marks on the ground in a circular pattern, as if a fire had been lit there and allowed to burn in a perfect circle. No bodies were found, but the pattern was unmistakable. The sheriff at the time, remembering the Renshaw case, wondered if the covenant had struck again. But without bodies and without evidence, no conclusion could be drawn. The Carsons were listed as missing, and eventually the case went cold. In 1927, 18 years after the Carson disappearance and 36 years after the Renshaw massacre, another incident occurred. A family of 8 named Dalton, living in the Ozarks of northern Arkansas, not far from the Missouri border, was found dead in circumstances that precisely matched the Renshaw case. Bodies arranged in a circle, throat cuts, missing blood, evidence of ritual. The investigator, a state police detective named Roger Mills, had heard stories about the Renshaw massacre and wondered if there was a connection. He traveled to Willow Springs and reviewed the old case file. The similarities were too specific to be coincidental. Mills began compiling information about other cases, looking for patterns. He found several possibilities scattered across the South and Midwest, families that had died mysteriously in ways that suggested ritual killing, often in 18-year intervals. Mills theorized that multiple covenant families existed, that they were connected through bloodlines or shared beliefs, and that they were all following the same deadly schedule. He tried to predict where the next incident might occur and when, but the families were too scattered and too secretive. Mills could never gather enough evidence to prove his theory conclusively. In 1945, during World War II, when much of the country's attention was elsewhere, another massacre occurred, this time in rural Tennessee. 11 people, all related, were found dead in the familiar circular arrangement. By this point, a small group of researchers and law enforcement officials had become aware of the pattern. They began to seriously investigate the possibility that a death cult operating across generations was responsible for periodic massacres. But every investigation hit the same walls. No witnesses, no survivors who would talk, no physical evidence connecting the incidents beyond the ritualistic similarities. The families involved left no paper trails, no clear connections to each other. It was as if they existed in a shadow world, parallel to normal society but separate from it, bound by rules and obligations that outsiders could neither see nor understand. Dr. Helena Morrison, a folklorist and anthropologist at the University of Missouri, became interested in the case in the 1950s. She'd read about the Renshaw massacre in historical archives and was struck by its ritualistic elements. Morrison spent a decade researching death cults, blood sacrifice traditions, and similar practices across cultures. She discovered that the idea of covenants requiring periodic blood sacrifice was not unique to the Renshaws. Similar beliefs existed in various forms across European, African, and Asian cultures. Some involved literal human sacrifice. Others were metaphorical, using animal sacrifice or symbolic offerings. Morrison theorized that the Renshaw family and related groups practiced a syncretistic religion, blending Christian elements with much older pagan traditions, possibly dating back to pre-Christian Europe. She believed the 18-year cycle corresponded to a metonic cycle, an astronomical period used in ancient calendar systems. The covenant families might have believed they were maintaining cosmic balance, preventing some catastrophe through their sacrifices. Morrison tried to find living members of covenant families to interview. She placed advertisements in newspapers across the South and Midwest, asking for anyone with knowledge of family blood covenants to contact her confidentially. She received hundreds of responses, most from cranks or people with no relevant information, but a few responses seemed genuine. One letter, from a woman in Oklahoma who refused to give her name, described growing up in a family that practiced similar rituals to those Morrison had researched. The woman said her family had escaped the covenant in the early 1900s, changing their name and moving far from their original home. She said the covenant families believed they were descended from a specific bloodline, possibly going back to medieval times, and that this bloodline carried a curse or obligation that could only be satisfied through periodic sacrifice. The woman said her grandfather had told her that long ago, an ancestor had made a pact with something, a supernatural entity or force, trading future generations' lives for power or protection or knowledge. The exact terms of the pact had been lost to time, but the obligation remained, passed down through blood, inescapable. Morrison published her findings in 1962 in an academic journal. The article generated some interest in folklore and anthropology circles, but was largely ignored by mainstream academia, dismissed as sensationalism or poor scholarship. Morrison died in 1976, her work on the covenant unfinished and unvalidated, but her research had documented the pattern clearly. Approximately every 18 years, somewhere in the American South or Midwest, a family would die in circumstances suggesting ritual sacrifice. The pattern had held for at least 100 years and showed no signs of stopping. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 1991, exactly 100 years after the Renshaw massacre, a group of paranormal investigators visited Renshaw Hollow. The property was by then part of Mark Twain National Forest, accessible only by hiking trail. The investigators wanted to document any supernatural phenomena associated with the site. They spent 3 nights camping in the hollow, using various instruments to detect anomalies. Their findings were mixed. Some equipment malfunctioned. Temperature readings showed unusual fluctuations. Electromagnetic field detectors registered spikes. Most significantly, several members of the team reported vivid nightmares involving circles of people, blood sacrifices, and a presence they described as ancient and hungry. One investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, woke on the second night to find herself standing in the clearing where the bodies had been found a century earlier. She had no memory of leaving her tent. Other team members found her there, apparently sleepwalking, muttering words in a language she didn't speak and didn't later remember. The team left early, unsettled by the experience. Chen's experience prompted psychological evaluation. Doctors found nothing wrong with her, but she continued to have disturbing dreams about the Renshaws for months after the visit. She eventually sought help from a therapist who specialized in trauma, and slowly the nightmares faded. But Chen told friends that she'd felt something in that clearing, a presence that was aware and watchful, something that recognized her as an outsider and wanted her to leave. She said the Renshaw Hollow wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was occupied, claimed, by whatever the Renshaws had been serving or appeasing. She believed the covenant was still active, that somewhere families were still fulfilling their bloody obligations, and that Renshaw Hollow remained a thin place, a location where the boundary between normal reality and something else was permeable. In 2009, the most recent incident that fits the pattern occurred. A family of 7 in rural Kentucky was found dead, arranged in the now familiar circular pattern, killed with precision, missing blood. The FBI investigated, suspecting cult activity. They reviewed similar cases going back decades and confirmed the 18-year pattern. Special Agent David Torres led the investigation. He compiled everything known about Covenant families, creating a database of incidents, locations, and possible family connections. Torres discovered that despite appearing isolated, the families were connected through complex genealogical networks. They'd been intermarrying for generations, maintaining bloodlines, ensuring the covenant continued. Torres attempted to find living covenant families, to warn them or arrest them or somehow break the cycle. He found nothing. The families had become expert at hiding. They used false identities, moved frequently, left no paper trails. Torres' investigation was eventually closed due to lack of evidence, but he remained convinced that the covenant existed and would strike again in 2027 if the pattern held. 2027 is approaching as this documentary is recorded. Researchers and law enforcement officials who are aware of the pattern are watching, waiting to see if another massacre will occur. Some hope the covenant has finally ended, that modern society's surveillance capabilities and reduced isolation have made it impossible for families to practice such rituals without detection. Others believe the covenant will adapt and continue, that families bound by blood and belief will find ways to fulfill their obligations regardless of external obstacles. The truth remains elusive, buried beneath layers of secrecy, superstition, and death. What is certain is that the Renshaw family and others like them believed they were bound by obligations that transcended law, morality, and even survival instinct. They believed their deaths were necessary, that failure to die would bring worse consequences. What those consequences were, no one knows. The Covenant families never explained their beliefs in detail to outsiders. They kept their knowledge within the bloodline, passed down through generations, written in books like the one found in the Renshaw home, and then hidden or destroyed before outsiders could read them. The clearing in Renshaw Hollow where nothing grows, where the soil remains black and dead after more than a century, stands as testament to what happened there. Soil scientists have tested samples from the clearing, trying to determine why vegetation won't grow. The results are inconclusive. The soil has normal pH levels, normal nutrient content, nothing that should prevent plant growth. Yet nothing grows. Some researchers suggest the ground was contaminated by chemicals used in the ritual, though no residue has been detected. Others believe the circle was burned so intensely that it sterilized the soil at a deep level. A few, mostly those inclined toward paranormal explanations, suggest the ground itself was cursed, marked by whatever force or entity the Renshaws were serving, made permanently barren as a reminder of the covenant's price. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? So we return to the question that has haunted investigators for over a century. What really happened in Renshaw Hollow in October of 1891? The physical evidence suggests ritual murder, carefully planned and precisely executed. The historical evidence suggests a pattern of such murders extending across generations and geography. The testimonial evidence, from witnesses like Thomas Hackett, suggests the Renshaws believed they were fulfilling an ancient obligation. But obligations to what? To whom? The Covenant families spoke of pacts and promises, of blood debts that must be paid. But pacts with what entity? What power could inspire such devotion that entire families would willingly die to satisfy it? These questions lead to uncomfortable territory, to possibilities that challenge rational worldviews. If we accept the covenant as real, not just delusion but actual obligation, we must accept that some force or entity exists capable of binding families across centuries, capable of extracting such a terrible price. The alternative explanation, that the Covenant families were simply suffering from generations of shared delusion, a folly aphamia that perpetuated itself through indoctrination and isolation, seems more rational but still disturbing. If family belief can be so powerful that it overrides every instinct for survival, every moral prohibition against killing children, every natural human resistance to death, then belief itself becomes a kind of supernatural force, not literally magic but functionally indistinguishable from it. The effect is the same whether the covenant was objectively real or merely believed to be real. Families died. The pattern repeated. The cycle continued. The most unsettling aspect of the Renshaw case and the broader covenant pattern is not what we know but what we don't know. How many covenant families still exist? Are they still practicing their rituals, just more carefully, in ways that avoid detection? Has the pattern truly been broken, or has it simply moved deeper underground, adapted to modern surveillance and investigation techniques? The 18-year cycle suggests the next incident should occur in 2027, but will it? Or have the Covenant families finally decided to break the pattern, to refuse the obligation and face whatever consequences their ancestors feared? We cannot know until the time arrives. And if another massacre occurs, if another family is found arranged in that terrible circle with their blood drained and their obligation fulfilled, then we will know that the covenant survives, that it adapts, that it continues regardless of modern laws or moral progress or rational disbelief. The Renshaw family's story ends in that clearing where 17 people died for reasons they believed justified such horror. But their story also continues in every unsolved case that bears the covenant's signature, in every isolated family that keeps too many secrets, in every community that knows something dark exists at its edges, but chooses not to look too closely. The massacre in Renshaw Hollow was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretches back into history and forward into an uncertain future. The buried truths that emerged from that investigation in 1891 revealed not just one family's tragedy, but a network of families bound by blood and belief, to practices that civilized society cannot tolerate, but also cannot fully suppress. And in the forests and hollows of rural America, in places where isolation still shields secrets from scrutiny, those families might still exist, counting years, preparing for the cycle to complete, knowing that when the time comes, they will fulfill the covenant as generations before them have done, adding their blood to a debt that can never fully be paid but must always be serviced, forever and always. Until some final reckoning comes or the last drop of covenant blood has been spilled and the terrible promise, whatever it was, whoever it was made to, is finally satisfied or finally broken. The Renshaws are gone, but the covenant remains, waiting in the darkness for the next family to step forward, for the next generation to accept the burden, for the next massacre to confirm that some obligations transcend death itself.